here's Alex from Black Sheep IT Consulting. Today we are going to look at a conundrum of sorts because we all know how form applets work and we know what HTML they generate. So let's start with a look at one specific form applet out of literally thousands that you can find in vanilla Siebel. So form applets are everywhere. So let's go to opportunities. Let's get to this one and let's take a look at this more info form applet. Now this is the vanilla more info form applet for opportunities in the Aurora theme. Now it's questionable, at least in terms of usability and layouting. So it's a little bit cramped, I would say. So let's go to About View and see, okay, that's the opportunity form applet child, big. Well, the big version of the smaller applet on top. Now, keep in mind, this is a vanilla applet, but you have, sure, in your project, you have plenty of form applets that maybe have an unfortunate layout like this one. So how does that layout come into existence? So of course the applet is designed with the normal Siebel web template. That means that's a applet form grid layout template. And I'm not even going into web tools right now because I can see the outcome of what the Siebel web engine generates out of the information from the repository. And if you have ever done this before, inspecting pieces of the Siebel document object model, let's clean that up a little bit here. So, well, I can already see what happens here. So TR, lots of TRs make up this form applet, and the TR is a table row. So if I scroll on up, there's a table body, which is a nice semantic HTML. There's the table itself. So the entire form section, if you will, of that form applet is rendered as an HTML table, quite clearly visible in the document object model. And you can see that some rows seem to be empty. And as I hover over the rows here in the DOM elements inspector, I can see that the first row of elements is here makes up 4 controls, and there are 3 controls in there. So the individual controls, well, they're all placed in table definition or TDs or, well, table cells, if you will. And inside there we find the diffs that make up, in this case, a grid label. And there's just the label itself. You can quite clearly see it here. And the next one is likely the field, which is a different class of div and has the input because it's a form applet, and you can use it to not only read but also query or insert or update data. So that is a simple thing you can do in any Siebel application in the browser. Inspect the DOM elements and verify that the layout is driven by that table. If you look more closely, you will see that the table definition elements have something called a col span, a column span, and a row span. So they span over a specific number of columns, and that gives them the width that they have on the screen. So the initial row is basically, the first row is just specifying the initial column widths. Now, we learned something here. If you look at these numbers, let me zoom in a little bit. If you look at these numbers closely, there are 8 pixels, 64, 8. So they're all on a factor of 8. And the factor of 8 is the 8 pixel is actually the Siebel standard grid snap width and snap height, if you will. So everything, if you move anything in the Siebel web template editor, it's actually moved by 8 pixels to the side or 8 pixels up and down. So that is interesting in itself, as the initial table style has a grid of a lot of columns that have, well, multipliers of 8 as the pixel width. And then there's another empty, and there's the column with the form sections here. So let's focus on this column. So you can see that it has fewer table definitions, only the relevant. And you can see this one spans 8 rows and has a column span of 3. It's entirely empty. This one spans 3 columns and 1 row. Most of them span 1 row. Yeah. But here's another, let's say, TD that is generated in the HTML as a filler and so forth. So you can take this up as long as you want to, and it's a really nerdy thing to do. And why do we actually focus so much on the table here? Because the question is, in this video, how can we actually modify the layout in a way that it's, let's say, more visually appealing, more lined up? Because you can see things are all over the place. Now this form section lines up with these fields, and there's another form section, and the labels are not lined up clearly. So it's definitely needs some work. And as the Siebel developer that we are, we can of course go to Siebel Web Tools, which I do not open here in this video. We can go to Siebel Web Tools and go to the layout editor and adjust carefully the orientation and the positioning and the width and the height of each and every control. And you can imagine that there are a lot of controls, like there's 100 controls in that applet. So you have to do 100 or even more drag and drop operations really carefully, and you might just mess it up and have to start over. Yeah, that happens to the best. So let's investigate a CSS only way of fixing up this applet, because it's clearly it can use more room than it uses currently, and it can be lined up more pretty. So let me just reload that view here. I've made a change to a style sheet I've prepared, and when I reload that and the style sheet kicks in, we can see that this applet is the same applet. It still is, but it looks visually different. But we can confirm, using the same technique as before, that this is still the same table that we have seen before, that we have inspected before. So something is different about the table. And if you're really eagle-eyed, then you already notice what's different. And you notice that the browser reports that each table row now has a grid layout. Now, that's interesting because grid layout is a CSS technique that I can apply to any element in HTML. And of course, I can apply it using style sheets. So that's the technique I would like to introduce to you here in this video. But first, we have to talk about CSS grid a little bit. I'm not teaching CSS here, but let's investigate what it is. So if we do a simple Google search, or you ask your favorite AI these days on table, HTML table versus grid CSS, that's a long discussion that has, well, divided developers over the past decades. Well, ever since CSS grid was really invented. And it's not as old as HTML tables. So even the first version of HTML probably had some table layout. And back in the 90s, when you wanted to design a web page and have some layout, even in a grid layout style, you have to use HTML tables. So if you digest that information you can find about the discussion HTML table versus grid, you will find that most people prefer these days CSS grid over HTML table, because HTML table is far too rigid for the modern responsive web design we have. And the CSS grid offers a lot of dynamics and a lot of cool things. So here this guy says CSS grid looks a lot cooler than HTML table. Well, he has a point there. And as an end user, you wouldn't care, right? You just want the thing to not look totally awful. There's even websites like this one I've just found by Googling cssgridplayground.com. So Google for CSS Grid Playground, which lets you help you understand the grid thing. So if you have a grid container and you display it as a grid, everything inside it is now subject to the grid. So let me just change that, for example, to, well, block the default display type, and we can see that there are 5 divs, well, around each other. On top of each other, and that's the block layout in HTML, right? Everything is on top of each other. So if we change this back to grid, oh, suddenly it becomes much more alive, because here, of course, there's a grid gap defined, which, well, we can just increase to see, okay, that defines the gap between the blocks or the elements in the container. Then there's a grid template on columns, which specifies 3 columns with a fraction of the entire width. So that's actually a bit of math you have to do. It's 1, let's do it easier. So that's 9, literally a fraction of 1/9 and 5/9 and 3/9 of the entire width can be consumed by each column. Then you have the similar thing for the rows. So the second row takes up, well, 5/7 of this. You can also use pixels if you want to. So I can go with pixels. Yeah, it's not a big deal. So you see, okay, adjusting this lets you play around with it. So take your time and explore the CSS grid, because we are going to dive into CSS grid a little bit. But the important thing is you can define a grid template based on columns and rows, so your initial layout, and you can even define template areas. So each element in the grid belongs to a grid area. That's just another CSS rule here, CSS property. Grid. I'm a member of the header area. I'm a member of the sidebar area. And here the grid template area is really funny, because you can, for example, reserve the sidebar element, all 3 columns. It's literally more visual if you see it in front of your layout eye, that the sidebar now consumes all the 3 rows, and the header only 2 columns on the top row, and the footer 2 columns, etc. So for example, if we do that with the footer, well, you see the outcome. The footer now occupies the entire bottom row of the grid. So this is actually quite a nice and simple way of learning CSS grid. There's a lot more. There are entire books with 1,000 pages probably on CSS grid. So I'm stopping here and go back to our Siebel application. So what's different in this layout than what we've seen previously? It's the same Siebel Web Engine generated HTML table, but each table row now uses grid layout. So you see my style sheet kicking in, but we can see that the table row, each table row in the applet uses grid layout. Now let me just change that. If I remove that, we can immediately see, okay, there's something going on now. It's misaligned. So if I enable the grid on all table rows in the table, so each individual table row is a container, a grid container. What are the elements in the row? The TDs, the table cells. So I can, for each row, I can define a grid template. So that's the first row here. It's not very interesting. So let's go for this this row here. And the grid template is a little bit involved here. So it's not what you expect, or it's probably what you expect. Remember, we have lots and lots of columns. So the grid template starts with 10 pixels for the first column, then using a variable for the label. And let me replace that variable really quick with a pixel value. And so I can look at the width of the second column as it adjusts here. So you get the general idea now by adjusting these values or using variables. So obviously I have a variable for field and I have 0 pixels here. So for the fillers, and then I have another label and another field. So if you imagine repeating that effort, and it's an effort, of course, you have to, well, figure that out and then find out the variable values for each label and field. But essentially it's finding out variable and field length and then finding the fillers. And the thing is that sometimes you have more columns to take care of, and sometimes you have fewer columns to take care of. So this is repeated all over the place. You see each, the 16th row, as you can see here, has a slightly different grid template than the other rows, right? So, and you can adjust this in the browser and really get it fixed up. So that's the general idea. So what does the style sheet look like? Well, here's the style sheet. And that style sheet is a demo. So I'm going to zoom in so we can really digest the information here. So it's a demo for fixing the Siebel Form Applet grid layout, which is confusing at first, right? It's called grid layout with CSS grid. And you will notice the CSS is written using nesting, which you can look up on caniuse.com, CSS nesting. Nesting is a technique of, well, having a slightly more hierarchical syntax, a nested syntax in CSS, which modern browsers support. Modern browsers also support variables, so I have some general label width, field width, and form section with variables, but I override them for this applet. Now you notice it's a weird way of specifying an applet in Open UI. BCRM, that's my company, Black Sheep CRM. I have a little JavaScript that actually tags up the applet. I call this technique tagging. So each applet gets its name in a safe way without, special characters as an attribute on the DOM element. And I also do that with elements like fields and labels. So I can identify each one in a more, let's say, readable way in the CSS. So this is the CSS for this applet. And here I'm overriding the variables, creating a new one called empty to denominate an empty row. You notice I'm following the template here as well. And the first part is some overrides for specific fields or labels. Notice there's the account location, for example, has a wider width. But here's the overall grid. So I'm setting every table row in the table in that applet to display grid. And then I have to create grid template columns for each and every row. So if I zoom out here, you can see I tried my best to make this as readable as possible. So you can see the 28 rows that exist in the HTML for this applet layout, and the 13 relevant columns. So there are many more columns, but they're all empty at the end. So the last one is always empty. And so I have 13 columns to take care of, and the first two are completely empty, and the third one is the first where we have some content. So we have a form section here. So you notice that the first column is always at 10 pixels, and there's a form section, there's another form section, and the rest is just empty. And then the next row is a label and a field, another label and a field. So it's 4 labels and fields, and so forth. So here's a little bit different. The fifth row is a little bit different. As we can see, if we go back, these fields occupy 2 columns, so they are wider. Yeah, and you might say now, after watching this that far, so okay, That's completely crazy. That's out of my league. That's too much CSS for me because I'm a Siebel developer and I understand that. And you want to go back to the Siebel web layout editor, and you can do that, of course, but you will only get a HTML table. At the time of this recording, the grid layout in Siebel Form Applets is an HTML table. And if you want to modify it in your browser in a meaningful way so that you can fix the alignment issues that you might have even after some time spent in the layout editor, you still have minor alignment issues, you can find a way of creating an overall template for all your form applets and reusing it all over. So it's a one-time effort to get this far, but then you're just hitch the ride and go along. So here I also have individual row level overrides for specific fields to fine-tune the positioning. So this actually is not supposed to be here. So yeah, there's that. And now the big question is, how do you actually get to this? Well, you can copy paste it, you can adjust it as to the columns, you can use Excel to create the initial layout, which I started with. But each form applet is a little bit different as they are. So you might want to visualize your form applet. So one way of visualizing your form applet early on, and I'm going back to the original layout here, is to, well, find the table. You can do this in your browser developer tools. You find the table and you just apply one temporary rule, the table grid back. That's the class of the table. So find every TD and make a border, 1 pixel solid. Let's make it dark gray. And now you're visualizing the HTML table, and can be very helpful to understand, okay, there's table cells that span different columns, as we mentioned. So it's immediately visible. Of course, the user doesn't want this, so you just do it in the comfort of your developer. And you can really make out the issues here. So this one is problematic. It's not lined up correctly. And this is actually this is the HTML table that is generated out of the repository. So you always have it in the browser and you can modify it with CSS. That's the whole point here. So what if you kind of use some colors to, okay, let's highlight the labels, let's highlight the fields or the form sections, the major parts of a form applet. Can we do that? Well, we can do that with a little bit more CSS effort. I have a little utility here, which allows us to visualize the table layout and combines it with information of the repository. So you can see here the first row now serves to show us the columns and gives us the information about which coordinates they have in the Applet web template. Now, if you know an Applet web template, and I'm still not opening Siebel Web Tools today, if you know an Applet web template, you know that a control such as the last name here, the top left column is at the 5th row, and it's the 10th column. So it's that's the item identifier in the web template. You can see when I hover, I can see that item identifier 5010. So 5 is the row number. Notice 5, and 10 is 10. So it's a preceding 0. So that's the 10th column, and that is exactly where the top left corner of that field is. Now the other field here, the first name, I can see it's 5032, so it's the top left corner is starting after the 5th row, and it's starting after the 32nd column, so 5032. Now how about that? So we can visualize the applet in a way to better understand the Siebel grid layout better than ever. And that knowledge can help us, and you will see in the next video what we can do with that. We can have an even more dynamic aspect of figuring out the CSS that will fix up our applet, or we can even, well, create some kind of editing functionality and maybe write back to the repository. Why not fix some things in the repository because they're messed up? Like, yeah, these labels here, they're clearly they're not aligned properly, right? So they should be aligned more properly. So we are diving deep already. And to finalize this video, I would like to demonstrate to you a little utility I wrote, and it will probably become part of DevPops in the near future, which generates that CSS for us. So let's go back to the original view and the layout of this applet. And what we want to end up with is at least a boilerplate of this grid layout. So you can see it's highly generalized. So fields, form section fields and labels have a distinct width, and then you have to take care of the fillers, which are usually 0 pixels, and then do some fine-tuning. So how to get to a first version of that grid? That's the question. And the answer is a, well, JavaScript function, which again might be or might not be part of DevPops in the near future. I have yet to figure it out. So this is my function I wrote, the form applet fixer upper, and it takes some parameters, and let me set that parameter to false as well. And you see that the output, let's zoom out here, is this exact boilerplate of the rows and columns, the grid layout for each row. So all you can do is copy that and then, well, put it in your style sheet, and you'll see, well, it's even almost aligned. So, and you can see it uses pixel values, and you can change that, but it looks very similar to what I have on top of that, what I have here. This is more refined, of course, uses variables. So, but you have your boilerplate here, and you see how you go from there. You know? Now you can fine-tune it. Still, there's a little bit more to do. There's like the width of the inputs. It's not perfect. So let's run this a second time. This time with a parameter I'm setting to true. And this applies a common width to, and also applies the grid to the applet. So now we can see what it looks like with this boilerplate grid template. And remember, it's just CSS, so you don't have to touch the repository. All you do is put this in your style sheet, and the applet will start looking, well, not perfect, but at least better than before. So it's a BTB, better than before layout, we could call it. But it's a start. You don't have to write all this up yourself, right? So you can just have a JavaScript generated, put it in your style sheet, and then modify it. So it's already looking pretty good, but it's not the thing we wanted, because some fields don't have the exact location where they should be. So there's definitely some work to do. And again, let's look at what the finished CSS looks like. Let's refresh that and, oops, sorry. Yeah, the finished CSS-only grid layout for a form grid applet looks, well, spectacularly, I would claim, better than the original without ever touching the repository, which might be an issue with you, I understand that. But it's a technique I would like to share, which we have successfully applied in a few projects where the form applet was quite complex, and the work in the Siebel Web Tools layout editor was not cutting it, and we were in need of fine-tuning the layout in the browser. So thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more information about Form Applets. Take care and bye-bye.